One version sees human beings as things. As things, human beings are self-independent substances. Another version sees human beings as what we make. Now, searching for the human being is also ironic. We may be seeking to eliminate our humanity in this project, in this quest of trying to become beyond human. Now, some of you who are philosophers know that Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, talked about this as the desire to be God. However, there are other things human beings desire, and for those who want to be God, well, that's their problem. Now, oddly enough, the human being exists. To exist is from the Latin existere, which means to stand out or to emerge. So the human being emerges from being. Now, this is really queer, and you'll hear me say the word queer a lot. It is queer because there is no reason for being to have continued there's no reason for being to have emerged from being. Being could have just simply continued to be. So in effect, existence makes human being a very queer being. We're queer creatures. This queerness raises at least three problems. The first problem is, well, what are we? The second problem is if we can emerge from being, then we are in some sense freed from it, and freedom then becomes a rather queer thing. Because isn't it queer to be able to become what one may wish, or even to live as one may wish? I mean, if you think about it, other animals don't have this luxury. Other animals seem to just be what they are. And even queerer, we emerge from that emergence to evaluate what we are. We even evaluate the fact that we can emerge. Okay? So we can evaluate our existence and get this, and even how we think about it. Now, I have argued in many of my writings that these are features of what's called Africana philosophy. If you are interested in more details, it's in a book called An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, which I won't say more, but you can receive easily in a rather queer way in Russia. In effect, Africana philosophy addresses the themes throughout these sessions. In fact, the theme of this exhibit. Because it first asks, okay, the philosophical anthropological question, okay? Now, the philosophical anthropological question is, what are we when our humanity has been degraded or challenged? Because Africana philosophy is connected to what you know as Africa and the African diaspora. And African diaspora is connected to what you know as black people. And black people, as you know, have struggled with the problem of many being forced into becoming property, and after that, the ongoing problem of racism, and even more. Now, on these issues, the philosophical anthropological issues, I prefer to think through the way Ada Julia Cooper, a woman from the 19th century, And Frantz Fanon, many of you know, this year he would have been 90, the psychiatrist, revolutionary philosopher from Martinique, the way they offer a critique of how we talk about philosophical anthropology, because when we talk about philosophical anthropology, we often talk about it as if we could talk about the categories separately. So we talk about race, we talk about gender, we talk about sexuality, we talk about class. The problem, and I will just put this succinctly, is I've never seen a race, a gender, a sexuality, or a class by itself. I've always seen an engendered race with a sexuality, with a class, etc. But what makes it even more complicated is if you think about it, if your humanity is challenged, if the question of what are you is posed, the problem you face is that if you were to try and justify your humanity in terms of those who challenged it, you would have made them the standard. And the question you must ask yourself is whether those who challenge your humanity are themselves a low standard. So you, in effect, then may say, what if you made yourself a standard? But if you did, you also have to question that standard. And so standards themselves become problems. Now, in Africana philosophy, freedom is the additional consideration, and it makes sense. Because if you think about enslavement, colonialism, racism, degradation, all of those things attack freedom. And then there's a third. The third I call the metacritique of reason. Now, there are many ways to talk about this, but I love the way Frantz Fanon did. Fanon said, when he walked in a room as a black man, reason walked out. Now, think about this. What do you do when reason is allergic to you? And you could imagine in the French, right? Because in the French, it's la raison, it's in the feminine. A lot of people don't realize this, but reason is a she, right? So what do you do if she runs away from you? Now, another way of putting this that's very tricky is how does one address unreasonable reason? If you force reason to reason with you, and you could imagine in a racist society, black man forcing woman to reason, you become violent. So you face a difficult task. You must reason with unreasonable reason, reasonably. Okay? Now, my critical work on how we reason and study has taken the form of a meditation on what I call disciplinary decadence. Now, forgive me for being short with some of my concepts, but you can look more in the future in the different books and articles. An example of disciplinary decadence is when you meet practitioners who criticize you for not practicing their discipline. It's the historian who criticizes the sociologist for not being historical. The sociologist who criticizes the historian for not being sociological. The anthropologist who criticizes both for not being anthropological. the scientist who criticizes the others for not being scientific, and you could imagine with the philosophers. Now, what disciplinary decadence is it fetishizes the discipline, it fetishizes the methods. Many of you, for example, when you produce a work of art, or you write an article or a book, or you simply engage in research, you will meet people who are not interested in your work's relationship to reality. They just want to know your method. That is the fetishizing of method. And why it's a problem is that your method could only work in the way they wish if there were methods produced by gods. Because if produced by gods, they will always have reality and truth. Now, the way out of this fetishizing of method, this decadence of methods, and I call it decadence because disciplines, when they're first created, are actually relating to reality, and the methods connect to reality. When they're dying, they ignore reality. And a good example, and why I'm bringing this up, is how it connects to the question of the human. Because with some disciplines, when they try to study human beings, if human beings don't fit the methods and the discipline, you know what the practitioner does? She or he says, "What's wrong with these people?" In other words, the people who don't fit the theory become problems. So, a way out of this is to drop the theory and pay attention to the people. And that I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. Yeah, it sounds fancy and sexy. But the short version is this: one must be willing to go beyond one's methods and discipline for the sake of reality. And some people would think this means being interdisciplinary, but I argue that doesn't work because it treats each discipline as if it was complete. In other words, it fails to communicate. And since communication is necessary, since relating to reality is necessary, I argue we need transdisciplinarity. Now, you could call this the epistemic version of trans. And I'm purposely saying trans here as we talk about transgender, transsexuality, trans. We have trans epistemic. Now, this meeting focuses on the first term, philosophical anthropology. But in truth, all three I've discussed, philosophical anthropology, freedom, and the metacritique of reason, all three are intimately connected. Okay? Now, you could probably guess, I'm hinting that the context is an historical de-queering of human reality. In other words, an effort to subjugate human existence. Now, this effort came about among the Hellenic ancients. For those of you who study philosophy, you always hear about Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides defended permanent being. Heraclitus was about the flow. But actually, the Egyptians, or properly the Kemetans, 2,000 years earlier thought in different terms. For them, it was how you relate to reality. But they too had collapsed into the effort to control reality. Now, control of outside and inside meant eventually a search for what we are. That's that philosophical anthropology question. Its historical forms were at first engendered and was very misogynous. In other words, woman-hating. If you read Aristotle's On the Generation of Animals, for instance, you would read some serious woman-hating there. But it's not in the way we think of women. Because in Aristotle's world, in On the Generation of Animals, there were two kinds of beings in our species. Fully developed ones and undeveloped ones. And you already could guess who the undeveloped ones were. There were men and undeveloped men. And if you want to read some comedy, I highly recommend reading Aristotle's On the Generation of Animals. For me, it's an hilarious, a very funny book. He even tried to explain that fully developed men had their bodies hot enough to produce sperm, and little people who go into the undeveloped men, whose bodies, if they're hot enough, produce fully developed men, and if they're not hot enough, they simply produce undeveloped men or menses, which we know as menstruation. So if you want a really bizarre way of looking at the human being, that's one of them. But what's crucial about that is that that bizarre way of looking at the human being, that strange way, is a way in which the idea of how the human being would relate to sex and sexuality was already there. Because what we talk about today as heterosexuality would make no sense in that world. Or what we talk about as homosexuality would not make sense. Because fully developed men with fully developed men was just considered natural. You see? Now, I don't have time to get into all the details, but a shift occurred when Columbus landed in the Americas and Christendom led to a new emergence, which we call Euromodernity and its associated colonial order. In that new world, a concept came along with it called race. And race actually comes from the Middle Ages, when Afro-Muslims dominated what is today much of Southern Europe. The word race, from raza, referred to breeds of horses, dogs, Jews, and Moors, okay? And in that world, as race emerged, that world was also a theological world, and it had a theodicy. Now, theodicy, from the word theo and dike, means God's justice. But it also means this. It's exactly like disciplinary decadence. It means that the God is all good, which means evil and injustice and anything unnatural is outside of God. And the project in that world then became how to put nature, put everything under the control of God. In effect, that became the way of domesticating reality. Now, secular theodicy is when you put something in the place of God, and that thing now becomes intrinsic. Now, if you think about the historical ways people argued about theodicy, they were straightforward. Many of you may remember the day when you realized, unless you're still believers, that God no longer was around. And it's very interesting what would make you think that. And for many people, it was because of evil and injustice in the world. Historically, if you look in the past to St. Augustine, he articulated the two classic ways to defend God. The first one is, who are you to question God? In other words, there's something wrong with you, not God. The second way is to say, you know what? God gave you freedom and you screwed it up. In both versions, God is left off the hook. Well, in a secular theodicy, we treat sciences, politics, in fact, society itself, like God. And when we do this, we commit what I call cividicy. That means the civic order as God, cividicy. It means you treat the civic order as intrinsically just. This is a search then to try to put everything back in its place. But now, to put everything in its place means other things are literally out of place. In fact, they're literally out. And you see the return of the queer language. Okay? Now, this means that those who are out have limited options and choices for a meaningful life. And this is now connecting to the theme of our meeting. Because we're talking about this question of the human under inhumane conditions. You see? The only wild remaining under these conditions are those queer beings, ultimately human beings, increasingly manifested in those who are not gods. So let me summarize. What racism does, what misogyny does, what all those dehumanizing things do, is to create a category of people who are considered godlike and perfect, with power over people who are by definition without perfection and who are deviant. Okay? Now, I could give you some stories as I move to get this analysis to a conclusion. When I first visited Australia, a cab driver, I went to an area with many crocodiles. And I asked the cab driver, anybody got eaten lately? And he said, oh, yes. And I said, was the person German or Northern European? And the cab driver said, how did you know? I said, tell me more. And he said a German woman was eaten just 2 days earlier. She decided to go swimming at midnight in a billy bog, which is their small ponds that are full of crocodiles. And then, and then you think about this, midnight swimming with crocodiles. And then I think of another example. You know, the people of Africa did not have safaris. Safaris were created under colonialism. And safaris are this fascination of going among animals, but here's the tricky part, not really as wild animals. I was brought on a safari one time, I didn't volunteer. I didn't know we were going on a safari. But before we left, there was a cage with a big cage with a lioness in it. And I'm not kidding. This Frenchman walked over to try to put his hand in the cage to pet the lion. When the game ward said, "Don't do that," the Frenchman turned around and said, "But why?" And the ward said, the game warden said, "She will eat you." And the man looked perplexed. And I could give many examples. And in literature, you already know the story of Tarzan. Okay? Now, what is going on here is something very powerful. Because you see, what has happened in the Euro-modern world is the elimination of the concept of wild animals. In fact, if you look at almost all of nature, it is treated as domesticated or controlled. Yet there is still a fear of the wild. The fear of the wild is what Frantz Fanon calls the fear of people in the zone of non-being. You all know who the wild are today. Look in the United States and you see all these black people being shot down by police officers. Those people represent the wild. You know what the wild are in terms of the people of whom many are afraid. They're refugees, immigrants. They're dangerous people. There are people in the world who would rather put their hands down the throat of a crocodile than sit next to a black person on a train. Now, this leads to an analysis, which will be my two closing remarks. The first is we need to have an analysis of how power is related to being human. Power doesn't exist in nature. Power is a function of the human world. It is how the human world negotiates force. Human beings can produce force as subjugation. That is when you control and domesticate others. But human beings can also produce power as the expansion of human possibility, which we could call freedom. But that is paradoxically a form of letting go. Now, the human condition in an other than human world requires how we relate to power. You see, we need power. If you think about it, without power, we can't do anything. All power is our ability to make things happen. We can make things happen to give us shelter, make things happen to make us healthy, and we can make things happen to create rules that would help us live with each other. In the old metaphysics, that was God. I always ask people, when you think about God, what would you expect if God were to show up? Could you imagine if she were in that theater? And let's not give a stereotype. When we make God she, we often give her a soft voice, but let's make her have a booming bass voice. So God shows up. Could you imagine? The first thing you would ask her is, are you God? Really God? And she will say, yeah. And you say to her, really? Really you're God? She says, damn straight. Then I know every one of you would ask her, you would say, if you're really God, do something. And if God were to say, I can't, you will say, what kind of God are you? God has been transformed, Sigmund Freud has argued, into a prosthetic form, which we call culture. And it is in that world, culture, that's the queer world. In that world, we produce meaning. That world, we produce all kinds of ways in which the human being can appear in an other than human world. Now, the problem is that although that is the world we create, how we appear, many human beings are unhappy with that world because they want that world to be like a world of gods, not a world of human beings. That's why we often get disappointed with politicians, because we seek to elect gods, but instead we get politicians, human beings. The human condition in an other than human world, the zone of non-being, if you think about it from the point of view of those people who are now the wild, internal to their world, they face in relation to the rest of the world, not being selves, not even being others. They face a world in which they're treated as if they're not human beings. And what do? Well, to be not a human being is to be forced outside of human relations. But a human being is a relationship. So in a world in which one is treated as not human, one fights for relationships, which requires practices of dignity and valuing sources of value outside the frameworks that are based on non-relations. In my writings, I argue we have seen this in art, the world of the imagination, and in Black societies. A good example in Black America is the blues. In the blues, for instance, you will find a tragic but sober relationship with mature reality. In blues songs, for instance, one of my favorite blues songs is by Dinah Washington. She sings, I got drunk last night and took my man to his wife's front door. And then she says, but his wife was a 45 packing mama. In other words, she had a gun. And she says, I ain't gonna do that no more. She simultaneously and ironically takes responsibility for reality. In politics, a lot of Black speech connects to power and is often treated as violent speech, when in fact it's a speech that is meant to liberate political reality. In Black existential thought, in Africana philosophy, this existential problem of irony, of emergence, it takes a form that is ironically beyond optimism and beyond pessimism. It's a trance that is not concerned with forecast, with guarantees. It's about the value of commitment. And that value of commitment I've written about goes back to a world in which one values being valued, not by those who dominate, but by those who are oppressed. In one of my writings, I gave an example of Frederick Douglass's, the African-American slave from the 19th century, the fact that he learned to value the love offered by his enslaved mother. She was separated from him from birth, but she risked life and limb. She risked being tortured, going through, facing wild animals at night, just to spend time with him for 6 months before she died. I pointed out to my students that although he was in a world in which he was called property, her actions showed him that he was valuable beyond the exchange commodity of the master. He was valuable because she loved him. But then students would miss the second important part. Because you see, in learning that he was loved, made him realize he was not just exchange value, property. However, when he learned to value being loved by her, a woman who was not valued in that society, he became a revolutionary. Because he began to value the point of view that had a relationship beyond the values of that society. So to conclude, beyond optimism and pessimism, there is the leap into life without guarantees of landing safely on the other side. And this existential paradox is part of what it is to think of the human beyond inhumane conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis. Okay, questions, please? No questions. Well, then I have a question. In your lectures, in your writing, you often come back to this idea that it's necessary to turn away from agonistics as the main principle of human and academic relations today, and turn towards relationality that was, by the way, mentioned many times today in many talks already. Relationality marked by an urge to understand oneself and others without losing this sense of reality, right? Unfortunately, as we know, the sense of reality is lacking on a global scale today. Architects of neoliberalism, for example, they save banks and corporations, they save capitalism instead of saving human lives. And they still see as the main challenge that of the slow growth and not the growing inequality, thus pretending not to understand how they're really related. The number of subhumans is growing, and the underside of modernity is almost unable to contain us all. And no matter how we try to channel the double consciousness from anger to re-existence, it remains a very difficult task, and sometimes hardly possible other than on the most personal level. So, do you think that it's yet possible to turn this present unending crisis into a new opportunity? Do you believe in that option?
The answer to your question takes a few forms. What I hinted at in my talk is when I say the human being is a queer reality, what is queer is relationality. And what I mean by that is that that upsurge means a reaching for that which is beyond itself. Now, with the emergence of Euro-modern capitalism, the best example I have argued is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, with his atomism, gave the model of a human being as something moving to collide with something else. And the response to that, as we know with Hobbes, was the Leviathan, which was basically a big way of keeping things from colliding. His God was the God of order. The thing, though, is that it meant seeing the human being as an isolated individual thing. This isolated individual thing can only have power if it is a God. And so, because it is not a God, it faces larger examples of power than itself. And that became, for Hobbes, the sovereign or the Leviathan. But we know that what actually emerged was private, collective capital. So the individual, vulnerable, was left to face the corporation. This was a model perfect for capitalism. It made the human being as individual helpless, weak, powerless, impotent, all those things. Now, today, we are living in a world in which the corporate powers have two forms. One form is neoconservatism, which wants to throw us back to the world of Hobbes and order. Another form is neoliberalism. Now, if you look at this, one wants to throw us back to the 17th to 18th century. Neoliberalism wants the 19th century. The 19th century wants the individual, and they want the market, capitalism. If you look at neoliberalism, neoliberalism says you have rights only as individuals. And interestingly enough, other thinkers, Jean-Paul Sartre in The Critique of Dialectical Reason, but others, W.E.B. Du Bois in Black Reconstruction, Frantz Fanon in Le Dernier de l'Éther, there are many who brought this up. No individual can stand against corporate power. This was the insight of Hegel, Marx, Gramsci. There are many who've thought about this. So what we need to take seriously is the organic element of power. Now here's what's interesting. Corporate capitalism, neoliberalism, if you look, we're now talking about the 17th to the 19th centuries. They don't want to talk about the 20th century. And the reason is the 20th century was the age of revolution. Now, what's odd in the 21st century is you do have some critics, some theorists who want to talk about the 20th century, but there's a paradox. They talk about the 20th century in the way the neoliberals and the neoconservatives talk about the 19th, 18th, and 17th centuries. In other words, they want a 19th century, 20th century. They don't realize that even the analysis of class was an open question, not a closed one. And that is because if you look in the past, each century was trying to imagine what it was to have a human being suitable for the next century. Here in the 21st century is one of the first times in the history of our species where people are not thinking about the next century. When was the last time you met someone who's trying to think about the 22nd century? People in the 19th century were obsessed with the 20th century. People in the 20th century were obsessed about the 21st century. And so what is going on? Well, something has happened to our species at the level of space and time. At the level of space, we're now in a world of 8 billion people, which means our planet has become smaller. At the level of time, we have technologies of speed. Information is speedy. Traveling physically is faster. All those things have changed the meaning of space and time. And because of this is closing off how human beings think of the future. Now, what has happened is that this has led to a politically anxious situation. Neoliberals and neoconservatives do not actually want human beings to think in terms of a future. Because a future requires always a transformation of the present. In fact, that is what we really mean by the left in the past, even though the term was just about the division of the French Parliament. The left was future-oriented, the right fetishized the past. But the future is that emergence, that queerness I talked about, that deviation. And so what now begins to happen is the very difficult task of what kind of commitments should we face or build for the 22nd century. Now, this now brings the question you raised about agonal practices. Because you see, the first part is agonal practices are forms of fighting in which, just as I talked about disciplinary decadence, it is to force you not to look beyond what's around you. And even with looking at what's around you, is to force you to not look at what is really around you. And the example I usually give is agonistics involve fighting, but winning may actually be winning what is false. So it is actually ignoring reality for the sake of victory. And we already know, we have actually heard politicians in the United States and in the UK say they're not interested in reality, they're interested in winning. You see? However, there is another model that is phenomenological. And that model is about being in a relationship of paying attention to reality. I try to demystify phenomenology. When people look at phenomenology, they often study it in a decadent way. They fetishize Husserl, Heidegger, even hermeneutics like Gadamer and those. But the basic insight of intentionality, that it has to be directed at something or someone or at the world, intentionality is really about relationality. It's about a relationship. But that relationship means ultimately seeing, understanding, hearing, connecting with what one failed to see, hear, understand, or connect with before. So it means, at its heart, phenomenology is about transformation. And if you think of the futuricity I talked about earlier, that is also about transformation and relationality. Now, to make it concrete, financial capital wanted to create unilateral power. It wanted to open markets for financial capital. Open markets for dominant power. Oh, I just flipped. However, they fail to understand that if you open a door to let yourself out, others can come in. All doors flow in multi-directions. So what is happening in the world today is simultaneously with the effort, the agonistic effort to close off options for people, there is simultaneously the opening of options that people are flowing through. This is because the information markets, the financial markets, the material flow markets are also highways of human flow. And this flowing means that new relations are developing that were not predicted. To give you a sense of what I mean, in my writings, I've been analyzing the concept of failure today. Okay? When I raise the question about the future, for instance, a lot of people will say to me, "What are you talking about? Are you talking about utopia?" And I say, no, I'm not talking about utopia. Because remember, I reject optimism and pessimism. You see? And people are not used to thinking that way. So what am I talking about? Well, let's look at failure. When I and others, and many of you there, pose the question of intervention, someone would say, you're going to fail. And if you ask, why do you say we're going to fail? The answer is always the same. Because we already tried and it failed. Right? In other words, if I can't do it, how the hell can you? Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Now, what I've found is that all around us is evidence of people doing the impossible all the time. There are many things people say cannot be done that people do. They say bumblebees can't fly. They do. I talked about Aristotle, who had a world that said women can't think because they're not developed. Well, you don't live in that world. In fact, I'm speaking to you, Medina. And you're speaking to me, a black man, in a world that people said couldn't think. So what happened? Well, what happened was that our ancestors simply ignored that and committed actions that were the foundations for the world that enable you and I and the people in that auditorium to communicate today. You see? And when they did it, they were brutalized, they were told they were failing. And here's the error people make. Why is it that we can do what we do today? There's nothing special in us that was lacking in our ancestors. What our ancestors understood, and I will use my ancestors, since my ancestors were not only African slaves, they were Tamil Indians, they were Chinese laborers, they were Arab Jews from Palestine, they were Sephardic Jews from Ireland, there were so many. What was the difference? Well, you see, their actions weren't for them. Their actions, anytime you fight to create an alternative, you have brought something new into the world. And the system has to respond to your struggle in a way that makes the subsequent generations have a different struggle. The issue isn't that we, us today, will be, are the alternative to corporate capital and those. The issue is what are we doing in our commitments that will be the foundations that will make subsequent generations have a different struggle. Now think about it. What enables us today to communicate means that those who fought for us in the past, it is actually, the success is all of us together. That's the relational part. You see? When we think about how we individually succeed, that's the Hobbesian neoliberal model. But when we think of ourselves as a relationship to an ongoing praxis, then we realize that the we who have created this world that is a different kind of struggle are intimately connected to the so-called those who failed in the past. In other words, it's an existential political argument about praxis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Lewis.